That's not how I wanted to celebrate my 70th birthday, Walter Butler thought, watching the first rays of the sun make their way into his prison cell. Perhaps he could have avoided such fate if he'd been a little more indifferent to strangers and to what he saw happening on that fateful night. The old man closed his eyes and lowered his head. The same scene immediately appeared before his eyes. 4 drunk men and a thin, innocent young woman with big blue eyes. It was rather dark when Butler heard the woman's cries for help and the men's laughter. He took his rifle and went outside to see what was going on. What happened to Walter Butler that fateful night? What were the consequences of his heroic act? And what is his connection with the mysterious woman who wrote the letter? You'll get to learn all the answers in this exciting video. The old man saw a group of men catch up with the young woman and start pestering her. She tried to get away from them. She screamed and cried, but it only seemed to amuse the attackers. Walter called out to the men, but they didn't pay any attention to the old man. Butler approached the group and wanted to scare the attackers with a rifle, but the safety was off and the gun fired. The shot hit the leg of one of the men, and his friends instantly disappeared into the darkness of the street. As it turned out later, the man's name was Ethan Ramowski. He was the son of a local businessman. The young man survived, although he spent quite a long time in the hospital and would most likely have a limp for the rest of his life. Despite everything that happened before Walter shot Ethan, the old man was sentenced to 20 years in prison, which, given his age, was basically a life sentence. The verdict was clearly influenced by the attacker's powerful father. That day was Walter's last court session, and he was supposed to get transferred to the county jail. He didn't realize that his problems weren't over yet. Having stepped into a cell, Butler ran his eyes over his cellmates. "What are you staring at?" asked someone from the distant bunk. Walter was exhausted from everything that had happened to him, so despite the angry looks and the spiteful comments, he went over to an empty bunk to lie down. "Did someone tell you you could take this bunk? Did you ask for my permission?" The old man heard the same voice again and felt a blow to his right side. The unexpected punch made Butler fall to his knees, pressing his hand to his side. But having gathered all of his strength, he got up to look his attacker in the eyes. "Who are you, and why do I need to ask for your permission?" The inmate obviously didn't like Butler's question, so much so that he got into his face and hissed, "Do you think I don't know what you did to Ethan? We grew up together. He nearly ended up disabled for the rest of his life, and all because of you. Rest assured that your stay here will be nothing short of torture. I, Thomas Reeve, can guarantee that. You won't get to show off your skills of shooting unarmed men here." After that, several inmates began to surround Butler. But the guards ordered everyone to line up for lunch, so all the inmates started moving towards the exit, hitting Walter on the shoulder as they passed him by. The meal didn't go without incident either. Having gotten his tray with something that barely resembled food, Walter started looking for a place to sit down. But he didn't even have time to do it when he felt a strong push in the back. The old man lost his balance and fell to the floor together with his tray. He saw a group of inmates surrounding him, led by that same Thomas Reeve. He squatted by the old man and said, "Are you so old that you can't even stand on your feet? You need to eat better. It's too bad that you dropped your food. I guess you'll have to pick it up now." With these words, Thomas grabbed Butler's hand and dipped it into the porridge spilled on the floor. No one stood up for the old man. On the contrary, everyone seemed to enjoy the show. The guards didn't seem the least bit surprised by what was happening and didn't intervene either. The harassment continued everywhere and all the time. Walter was constantly being pushed and punched and always had countless bruises on his body. But the men continued to endure it all and refrained from getting involved in the conflict. A few days later, the warden brought Walter a letter, which greatly surprised the old man. He had no idea who could have sent it because his son died in a military operation in Iraq, and his wife died a year later. The woman had heart problems and simply couldn't survive the news of her son's demise. Having opened the envelope, The man started reading the letter. The man's lips stretched into some semblance of a smile for the first time since he got to prison. It was the woman he'd saved that night who sent him the letter. "Hello, Mr. Butler. I never got the chance to thank you for what you did for me. Ever since my parents died, no one has ever helped me, let alone protected me. I'm very sorry that you ended up in so much trouble for doing it. It is because of me that you got sentenced to so much time in prison. I hope they treat you with respect and understanding there. I wanted to come in for a visit and express my gratitude in person, but I was told that you can't have visitors at this time. I will try again later. Sincerely, Emma Smith." Butler didn't notice as a tear started running down his cheek. He didn't consider himself a hero for what he did, but it was still nice to know that the woman he'd helped didn't forget about him. Ultimately, the other inmates, led by Thomas, noticed the old man's joy, snatched a letter out of Butler's hands, and tore it up. Butler was infuriated. He jumped Thomas. A fight ensued. Guards rushed into the cell and started pulling the inmates apart. One of them pulled Thomas off the old man and shouted, "Reeve, do you want to get another sentence? You'll spend the rest of your days here. Is that what you want? Calm down." It was only after those words that Thomas Reeve calmed down and gave the command for the others to get into their beds. But as soon as the guards closed the door, Reeve came over to Butler's bunk and growled right in his ear, "You won't get away with this. This isn't over." The days went by, but the harassment never stopped. Fortunately, the old man now had a ray of light in his life: letters from Emma. The young woman became like a granddaughter to him. She told him about her life and thus gave him a little feeling of freedom. Unfortunately, Thomas never forgot about the situation with the letter and was simply waiting for the right moment to take his revenge. Once a week, the inmates went to take a shower in a special washroom. Reeve and several of his friends followed Walter and quietly ordered the other inmates to leave the room, thus leaving the old man alone with them. "Payback time, Walter. You will now answer for both what you did to me and to Ethan." With these words, Thomas and his friends attacked Butler and started beating him up. They didn't stop until the old man lay motionless on the cold tile floor. "Tom, he's not moving," one of the attackers exclaimed. "That's not good. Let's get out of here. I'm not about to get years added to my sentence over this old man." Reeve was alarmed and immediately left the shower room, followed by the other inmates. The light was blinding, even to Butler's closed eyes. The man frowned and slowly opened his eyes, which made him feel terrible pain in his entire body. He saw white walls and a white ceiling and thought that he was in heaven, but when he heard a woman's voice, he realized that he was still alive. "They beat you up real bad. That's just inhumane. They didn't even show respect for your age. What did you do to get Reeve so worked up?" "Reeve? What does Reeve have to do with any of this? As for the age, that's been a bit of an issue, you're right. It's probably the reason why I couldn't keep my balance when I slipped on the wet tiles in the shower," Walter responded to the doctor's question. The doctor quickly looked up from the chart. It was clear that he didn't believe a single word out of Walter's mouth. "You mean to say," the woman continued, "that you managed to break 2 of your ribs and get numerous bruises all over your body just by slipping?" Butler tried to sit up, but the pain in his left side was simply unbearable. "Wet floor, hold bones, it happens." "Don't get up. You need to rest for now," the doctor said, approaching Walter and getting him to lay back down. Butler told the same story to the Commission of Inquiry and the guards and to everyone who questioned him about the events of that day. The time he spent in the infirmary seemed like an incredible vacation to the old man. He was also happy to get another letter from Emma, especially since she told Walter that she was finally allowed to visit him. A few days later, Butler was discharged and had to go back to his cell. He was getting ready to endure more beatings and humiliation, but when he stepped into his cell, he noticed that no one even paid attention to him. After standing at the entrance for a bit, Walter slowly walked over to his bunk, but there were no pushes, no punches, and no snide comments. The next day, the inmates got to go out into the yard and spend time in the fresh air. They gathered in several small groups out there, each of them doing something of their own. But suddenly, Thomas Reeve fell down, panting. He clutched at his heart. His face turned red, and a wheezing sound escaped from his mouth. Everyone saw it, but no one rushed to help the man. No one but Butler. The old man quickly ran up to Thomas, laid him on the floor, and started checking his pulse. "Where does it hurt? Is the pain sharp? Do you feel discomfort in the upper body, in the neck?" But Thomas continued to choke, and his pulse was barely palpable. Butler knew what to ask and what to do, because his late wife had the same symptoms. "We need a doctor! He's having a heart attack!" Walter called for help. "Hey, are you deaf? Get a doctor, right now! He's going to die!" Walter continued to scream. The guards whispered something to each other, and eventually, one of them went to get the doctor. Butler knew that they couldn't afford to waste any time, so he started giving the man chest compressions. He applied rhythmic pressure on the man's chest, making approximately 100 to 120 compressions per minute. Other inmates watched him in shock. After all, Thomas gave Walter such a hard time, the old man could have simply stood there and watched him die, but instead, he was trying to save the man's life. The old man continued with the compressions even after the doctors arrived, and the inmates were sent back to their cells. The guards couldn't get Butler to step aside. They had to literally grab him by the arms and pull him away. But Butler looked back at Reeve and tried to get back to help. They'd put Thomas on a stretcher and put an oxygen mask on him. Reeve turned his head and met Butler's eyes. They nodded at each other, which meant more than any words could say. Thomas didn't return to his cell that day or in the following days. The guards didn't tell the inmates what had happened to him or where he was. Then came the day of Emmett's visit. They were separated by a glass partition. The young woman smiled at the old man and picked up the phone. Walter sat down across from her and also picked up the phone. "Mr. Butler, you have changed so much during this time. Are you all right?" Emmett began the conversation. "Since I have no parents, you become like a real grandfather to me. Thank you for what you did that night. Thank you for saving me." "Emma, thank you," Walter interrupted her. "Since my son and wife have died, you were the only person who ever needed me." They didn't have much time to talk, but their conversation was very warm and emotional. Emma managed to tell Walter that she was getting married, and that she was very sorry that he couldn't be there. It upset Walter too, but he couldn't change anything. "Walter Butler, hands behind your back and step out." The guard came to Walter's cell the very next morning. The old man didn't understand what was happening and why he was being pulled out of his cell. The situation looked especially suspicious because there were other guards accompanying them. It became clear that they were taking Walter to see the prison warden, but he didn't know what it was all about. While Butler tried to figure out what was happening, they arrived at their destination. He was led into a gray office with a wooden table, littered with various documents and office supplies. A man of about the same age as Walter was sitting at the table. "Walter Butler, your case was reviewed and, taking into account all the circumstances, your sentence was reduced to 1 year. Given the time you spent in prison during the investigation, your sentence will be over tomorrow." The old man couldn't believe his ears. The warden came closer to Walter. "You saved Thomas Reeve's life, and he's not the man to forget such things. He knows some very powerful people, trust me. He was transferred to another prison where he'll continue to serve his sentence, but he remembers what you did for him." The time he spent in prison seemed like a nightmare to Walter Butler. After his release, he started living a completely different life. Emma Smith came to pick him up on the day of his release. He walked her down the aisle instead of her father. She and her husband visit Walter often, and they invite him over too. The old man found a family that he didn't have for a long time. A few years later, around Christmas, Butler went to the fair to buy gifts for his new family. There were a lot of people there. Suddenly, Walter saw a familiar face in the crowd. The man also noticed Walter and came over. "Walter, I'm so glad to see you. Thanks for saving my life. You truly are an incredible man. After what you did for me, I thought a lot about my life, and I changed a lot. I'm sorry for the way I treated you. I hope you'll find it in your heart to forgive me." "I'm happy for you, Thomas. I hope your life works out. Merry Christmas," Butler replied. "Merry Christmas, Walter," Reeve smiled. They parted as if they were two old friends, leaving a warm feeling in each of their hearts.